We just want to say thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kenyora Parham. I'm the Executive Director of End Rape on Campus, and our mission works to end campus sexual violence by providing direct support services for survivors in their communities, prevention through education, and policy reform on the campus, local, state, and federal levels. And I am accompanied by my co-partner from the Every Voice Coalition.
Hello, thank you, Kenyora. My name is Nora Gallo, she, her. I am co-executive director for the Every Voice Coalition, which is a student and survivor-led nonprofit striving to end campus sexual violence by passing student-written, survivor-centered legislation, building grassroots and bipartisan coalitions, and empowering the next generation of civically engaged community leaders. With that, I'll pass it off to Kenyora to talk more about today's event.
Thank you, Nora. So with today's conversation, Shifting the Narrative for Pan-Asian Survivors of Violence is a part of EROC Centering the Margins events in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And under our Centering the Margins framework, we really truly aim to provide and support and amplify historically marginalized and underserved student survivors in the campus sexual violence space. And this also includes the anti-violence movement overall. So in this conversation, our intention is to create a safe, brave community space to express how this double, triple, and possible quadruple pandemic of a global virus, heightened awareness of white supremacy, police brutality, and gender-based and culturally based violence has affected our livelihood. This also includes our physical and mental health. And we especially want to acknowledge that during this conversation is happening during a time in which the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial may be read at any moment. So we also want to just share our solidarity with the families of those who have been affected by Derek Chauvin or any other police brutality, including the families of George Floyd, Daunte Wright, and Adam Toledo. And we just essentially want to state that we are organizations and individuals that have deep values that are centered on anti-racism and anti-discrimination. And so particularly, we also want to share our solidarity with our Pan-Asian communities who have also been affected by gender-based violence and violence in general. And since what we know at the start of the pandemic, nearly 70% of anti-Asian hate incidences have been directed at women. And so as I mentioned before in previous webinars, and I'll mention in this particular one as well, the dehumanization and criminalization and vilification of people of color must come to an end. And in this space, we really want to have where people learn from one another. And if it happens, respectfully disagree. We want this to be a safe space for all of our Pan-Asian survivors today and always. And with that, I'll pass it back off to Nora.
Thank you so much. And with that, we do want to provide a trigger warning for sexual violence, racial and cultural violence, and all forms of trauma that may come up in this conversation. Before we get started, I'd like to share with you that this webinar is being recorded. Attendees do not have the ability to share their screens, but you do have the ability to interact with each other in the chat, whether through Zoom or on Facebook. For any of you who may be watching this on Facebook Live, we want to give you an advance apology in that we may not see your question in time, but we do want to do our best to follow up on this forum or in a follow-up email. This conversation is expected to run for about 90 minutes, and it will be available to watch on End Rape on Campus's social media platforms, Facebook and YouTube. Unfortunately, Instagram only allots an hour for IGTV videos, so it won't be available. As we mentioned, this is a community space and would love for you all to feel free to send in your questions in the chat. And if you'd want to ask in front of the entire community, if you don't want to ask in front of the entire community, feel free to send questions to Kenyora or to myself in a private chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend and our moderator for this afternoon's important conversation. Sydney Rae Chin, whose pronouns are she, her, is a survivor, edu-guide, and consultant empowering Pan-Asian diaspora women and non-cis men survivors to reclaim their sensuality and wholeness. She holds a degree from Emerson College in media arts production with a minor in African American and Africana studies. Sydney aims to hold space for women of color, especially survivors. She's a proud third-generation queer, polyamorous Chinese American woman. These identities inform the type of projects Sydney takes on. She currently resides and works in Lenapehoking, which is stolen land of the Lenni Lenape people. With that said, Sydney, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Nora. This was okay. Now I'm going off script, but like, this is just a dream come true, like meaningfully. This has been like something that we've been dreaming about for a while, so I wanted to like note that. So today we are joined by a wonderful group of people to share and discuss intersections of survivorship, Pan Asian identities, and other intersections. As those intersecting identities have been disproportionately impacted by gender based violence, racialized sexual violence, recent Title IX rollbacks, and COVID 19. We can all learn what solutions and support we need in all of our communities. So, to start introducing the panelists, first we have Jayda, pronoun she, they. Jayda Shuavarnnasri is a queer Thai American sexuality and love educator. Also, she's known as the sex positive Asian Auntie on Instagram, um, where she works to liberate folks from sexual shame by creating space for authentic conversations about sexuality, relationships, identity, and healing. The topics that excite her most are sexual exploration, identity, transform justice. We've been in a few spaces where we've talked about that personally, so and also non-conventional relationships. She's also the co-producer of Don't Say Sorry podcast that centers the experiences of Southeast Asian women navigating relationships, mental health, and sexuality. Next, we have Prisha Sujin Kumar, pronoun she, her, hers. She is a student activist at Boston University studying health sciences. She helped co found Campus Survivors, one of the first survivor story organizations in the United States. And this past year, she led a protest against institutional compliance and sexual violence with 600 students in Boston, which is huge because Boston's a college town, um, as part of the National University Students Nash University Survivors Movement protest. Oh God, sometimes a handful. She is also on the executive board of USM, where she exists as a co-organizer and member of the PR team. Finally, we have my friend Varuna Srinivasan. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Varuna. Is a queer American woman with pronouns she, they. She writes and creates educational content around decolonizing sexual health, prioritizing emotional well-being, wellness, and reproductive justice. You can find her work online on her website as well as on Instagram. All right. So with that, with the introductions all done, um, I wanted to go into the first question. The anti-Asian misogynistic murder that occurred in Atlanta over about a month ago was a clear act of racialized gender-based violence. As we begin this conversation, we also want to acknowledge that who's missing from this room and the space that we're holding. The most vulnerable members of our communities include those who are migrants, undocumented, working class, and so forth, and that they're deeply affected by racialized gender-based violence. So, with an uptick of anti Asian violence that has always existed, how do we shift this conversation into victimhood survivorship of Pan Asian survivors of sexual violence? Varuna, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, can we go over the question one more time?
Yes, I forgot that I was muted. With an uptick of anti Asian violence that has always existed, how do we shift this conversation into victimhood slash survivorship of Pan Asian survivors of sexual violence?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thanks for, first of all, having me on this panel. I am very thankful for the space, and it's so important to be in this conversation. And I'm really glad that you said that, there are many people that are missing from this conversation, because I think that that's something that isn't really brought to the spotlight. Very recently, we saw 8 women who were killed in Atlanta. Um, and we're also, that shed a light on sort of the history of Asian American discrimination, but it's also what we don't really see in terms of a lot of migrant populations that come to the US that are sort of dependent. And we know that IPV perpetrators are usually known to the victim. and many of them are dependent on them for immigration status. So they're not really able to report them to the police. And so we don't really get the full picture in terms of like demographics. And I think that it's difficult to sort of speak for the Pan-American. I don't know what you think, Jayda, but I think it's so difficult to talk about everyone's unique experiences. But I think like as a South Asian, personally, like no one really, it's hard for us to find a place, especially as like a moral minority. I think the idea is that we've sort of moved here and that, we're just trying to survive, not thrive. And it's just very nuanced.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I completely agree. The experiences, even just in this room, are going to be super unique, right, to our individual selves and then our community and things like that. To Sydney's question around like, how do we shift from talking just about anti-Asian violence to sexual violence? I mean, that in itself has been such an ongoing struggle for survivors of sexual violence, right? Violence that we can see straight on in this video format for like 5 seconds is so easy to understand for people, right? And I think that's why it's when we see an person being attacked like that, there's nothing that you can do to deny that, right? And sexualized violence isn't caught on camera often, right? It's something that happens so hidden within our relationships, within our families, within our communities, right? It's so quiet. It's not something that someone took sometimes they do, right? Like a 15-second video and share that out. So that's like that in itself. But because it can be read as consensual, it's very difficult, I think, for people to conceptualize what sexual violence actually is, to be honest. Yeah.
Prisha, do you want to add anything?
For this question, I feel like Jayda and Varuna really covered it. I do think that a lot of the time when we look at gender-based violence, we do, like a lot of the time the sexual violence is like a missing component. At least like I know like the way the media did report this specific incident of violence, it wasn't until like I like looked more into it, I even really understood what happened. It's like a stigma that's really difficult, and I think that really takes away from the like immensity of what happened. So I feel like there needs to be a big change in how we do report and share these tragic stories.
I could not agree anymore. That was so poignant and such a great observation. So with that in mind, with the intersections of white supremacy, patriarchy, and parody culture, which Jayda also had a really great Instagram post on that I'm referring to, resulted in the sexualized violence of Asian women. Both Western and Asian imperialism have used rape as a weapon of war. An example of that is the comfort women who were systemically raped by Japanese soldiers during World War II. Another example is how both Asian and US military recruit poor men of color for war while encouraging them to commit sexual violence against Asian women. And to refer to deeper, if you want to get a deeper understanding, look to Jayda's post that went viral last month on their Instagram page. It's a great graphic and the whole post goes into more detail. So within this space and elsewhere, sexual violence is a form of racialized violence. With that in mind, with the historical roots in both white supremacy and patriarchy, both Western and Asian, how do we combat sexual violence within our communities? And I'm gonna hand it off to Jayda because this question
Such a big question. How do we do it? Yeah, a little bit about the visual that Sydney is talking. It's a Venn diagram basically that I drew out of frustration, right after the Atlanta shootings. I was upset. I didn't have words to formulate. Not that I was trying to, but I didn't have words. And so usually that means I have to visualize something. And I watched an IG live by Erna Kim Hackett talking about this naming basically white supremacy and patriarchy overlapping, patriarchy by people within our own communities, our own Asian community, and then purity culture all on top of that, right? And that's just kind of, I had to conceptualize it in some way and then think of all these ways where like, this isn't new. This is something that we're dealing with constantly. And so I was frustrated mostly not just with those systems. I was actually really frustrated with the way cis Asian men were so silent about this violence, right?
I think they froze for a little bit. Might have been an internet blip or something. Zoom does this, so we're just gonna roll with the technical difficulties. But I know that they were on the heels of a really great thought regarding Asian cis men, because I was feeling them with that thought on my anger towards them, honestly. Also, Kenyora put in the chat Jayda's Instagram post so that people can refer to it while we're talking about this and also while we wait for Jayda to get back online. But Varuna and Prisha, do you have any thoughts in the meantime while we wait for Jayda to get back online?
Yeah, I can definitely jump in. I think that, you know, for a long time in the eyes of white supremacy, and I think that like European colonizer, I think that the East has always been a goal of conquest. You know, whether it's, you know, it's after like certain, it's after land, but it's also after the women, right? I think that women in are very like important matriarchal figures um, in certain countries, and when you have that control, and you're able to sort of control their reproductive fate, in a word, then you're able to exert full control over the population, right? And that's kind of what we see. And I think that sort of passive conquest comes in, yeah, even in our modern day today, you know, whether it was like past imperialism, um, you know, to an extent, there have been a lot of influences, especially like speaking for India, you know, even like the whole idea of like South Asia and the way that we all behave with each other was a result of like white supremacy, right? And that's so indoctrinated in the way that we like view each other today, the way we view ourselves, right? And even here, like when you like date someone, it's often an idea of like an idea of conquest for them, that they have been able to like, they're able to control Asian women. And that's why we see a lot of like white supremacists and even men who are like exclusively date Asian women, or are more, or say like, oh, Asian women are better, or make statements like Asian women are better than white women. It's definitely like, they think of us as easy to control. Sorry, Jayda, do you want to pick up where you left off?
Sorry about that, y'all. Yeah, you know, technology these days. Yeah, so I was talking about my frustration with cis Asian men and their silence around this particular incident, in terms of like the sexualized piece, right? Like the sexualized, racialized violence. But generally speaking, like Asian women have been talking about sexualized violence and this violence against us for so long, and cis men tend to be silent about it. And I think for me, like when you ask the question on how do we like even address this within our own community, I think the challenge is that we have to help folks understand that like by not addressing the sexualized violence that's happening amongst ourselves, you're also not confronting your own internalized patriarchy. You're not able to confront the way that your friends are perpetuating sexualized violence, but you're also not able to support other male survivors who are also survivors of sexualized violence. And that is even deeper. And the thing that I want to bring up to the forefront is like, oftentimes, even within this dialogue around survivorship, we see it as like men are the perpetrators and women and femme folks are always the survivors, but we often forget that there are male survivors who are even like more hidden, because as a community, we just don't know how to talk about this at all.
Thank you for bringing all those wonderful points up. And yeah, I totally agree on Asian cis men just being silent about gender-based violence within our communities. And if we can't even confront that, how are we going to confront it outside of our communities? And you made that really clear in your initial Venn diagram post, which Kenyora conveniently put in the chat for anyone who's interested in reading more. Prisha, do you have any thoughts around the question?
Well, I think there's like a lot to unpack, like regarding just like the imperialistic nature of sexual violence towards Asian individuals. And it's like not fair to view the issue without considering it. I agree with what Varuna was saying before, in that there is like a conquest type of dynamic still with how Asian women, not Asian women, white men see and date Asian non-men. I've seen this like, I'm in college, so I use TikTok a lot still. But I've seen that like yellow fever and Asian fetishization like being excused almost like as a compliment, and people dismiss it very easily and say like, oh, it should be like a flattery, but there is like a real danger to it, as we've seen with like recent crimes. And it's like more often towards East Asian women, but they're always seen as a trophy to be won. And I think that we have to really move away from this, and there's no way to really combat the sexual violence in that community without really addressing like these weird, like, they're not even like microaggressions at this point, but like these stereotypes that they face. Because oftentimes like they're like told like, oh, you should be flattered in this situation, like you shouldn't feel like upset or terrified. But I don't know, it makes me like very uncomfortable. So I think we have to like start with that as like a good starting point before building off of it.
I just want to jump in and also say that like systemically, right, we see that also on porn websites where Asian is like one of the subsections. Like it's like there's like the mainstream, and then if you have like a fetish, like, okay, I mean, like it's okay to have, it's like BDSM, and then there's like lesbian, which like don't even get me into that. And then there's girl on girl, which again, don't get me into that. And then there's like Asian, and then there's like Indian. Like I remember like going into like the Indian section of the porn website and just being like, I wonder why this isn't mainstream. But I guess that a lot, so, and it's always like a white guy with an Indian girl. It's never like an Indian person with another Indian person. It's like a white guy with an Indian person, or a white guy with an Asian person. We've seen like movies. I would encourage everyone to see that documentary called Sex Explained. Janelle Monáe is the narrator for that, and she also like in the first episode like goes into how Asian persons have been like fetishized. And, you know, even like in movies, like even if you like, not, I'm not even talking about like movies from the 60s, the 50s, or the 70s. I'm even just talking about like rom-coms from the early 2000s, where they constantly just show Asian folks in a really bad light. Like I think even recently, our favorite movie, Mean Girls, where like the cheerleader who's like caught in you know making out with, like, first of all, he is making out with like a minor, like she is like below 18, but it's like sort of like she's made to wear these provocative clothes and seem like she's a lot more like sexual for her age. And so that's kind of like, okay, like it's not such a big deal. So I think like all of these, like it slowly like was just like snowballing, right? And we see that. And even like when this guy like just went ahead and killed 8 women, it was like, oh, he was having a bad day. And it's like, no, just name it. Just name that it's white supremacy.
Yeah. This one's like a long, we could talk about this for the rest of the time that we're here, you know? I I wanted to talk, just to mention, because I think it's something that most people don't know, is when we talk about purity culture, it, in its essence, what it does is position anyone outside of the white body as othered, right? As impure, as immoral, right? A white, thin, whatever, everything else able-bodied person. And that is what allows folks to fetishize other people who are not white, thin, able-bodied, right? And one thing too, when we're going back to kind of like how folks within our community don't know how to have this conversation, that layer, that nuanced layer of purity culture. Oftentimes when they talk about anti-Asian hate, everyone always cites the Chinese Exclusion Act. But the first anti-immigration law was actually the Page Law in 1875, which banned Chinese women from immigrating into the United States because they were potentially going to be prostitutes when they got here, right? And so that in itself, the like racialized sexualized violence against Asian women happened first, documented at least, in the United States before the Chinese Exclusion Act that most of these, most of people in our community will talk about. So there's a long history here.
Yeah. Also, it's just really hard to like put it all into one question because, again, I feel like this is only the start of many conversations that we need to have both inside of our communities and then also outside of our communities. So with that being said, oh wow, okay. Varuna just mentioned that you have to, for current immigration, you still have to get STI tests. Wow. Okay. That is, I didn't know that.
And it goes all the way back, right, to that 1875 policy. Yeah.
When I was immigrating here, they made me take HIV, syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia. I was like, well, you know what? It doesn't matter that I have an MD and an MPH and I'm, accomplished. They're always going to judge me by the color of the skin, and it's just going to continually just say immigrant on my face. I had to go and see a doctor, get a sign off, and then submit it to the US states government. Every single person who immigrates here has to give an STI test. And and I don't know what happens if it's positive. Mine was negative, fortunately. And it's a privilege.
Well, with that being said, and what we know with what's being discussed in the national discourse around sexual violence and just violence generally, folks of color, especially with intersectional identities, are not being centered, as we all know here. With the technology we have from Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, we're seeing heightened awareness around systemic oppression and white supremacy. At the same time, it seems the only reason we hear about folks of color in the media may be due to all these apps that we have, Instagram, TikTok, etc. Otherwise, we know the most viral moments do not center folks of color with the most intersectional identities. So how do we go about from being reactive to having engaging and uplifting conversations that constantly center these voices? Prisha, I would love for you to start us off.
Yeah, so I always would like to think that by now intersectionality is just like ingrained into the conversations and ideas that we have, but it's very obvious that this isn't the case. And something that I've seen very consistently is that, as Sydney just said, we don't really talk about marginalized communities until there's like a violent graphic video or crime that's just circulating around the media. And I'm not saying that I'm not happy to see these conversations, but it is very concerning to not see the conversation begin until we're really forced into like this corner and we're like watching things unfold rather than like even talking about preventative actions, I guess. I think a big thing that allies can probably do is, instead of saying that they'll like start uplifting voices of color, is to really actually allow them to have a platform. I've worked with like a lot of organizations that'll be like, yes, no, we want to support our peers of color, but they'll just speak over them and just give their own input on the issue instead of having actual voices that like are represented in those communities speak about this. I've like worked in like countless organizations that have done this, and it's always confused me because I'm like, yes, you have like the right idea going, but you're not really doing much. You're just perpetuating the idea. And I think that you're literally not doing anything, I guess, is what I've seen. That we need to really start focusing these conversations primarily, like starting from the beginning. Like I would like hope to see that after these like terrifying crimes, that now when we do talk about crimes of sexual violence, we're not like, the norm is not like cisgender white women. I think that's what we always think about when we consider crimes like this. And a lot of the times those are the types of stories that like get circulated widely throughout media. It's like more often than not, like Black and Indigenous women like have like significantly higher rates, but we don't see them in the media. It's usually like we see the same stories of cis white women. And I think that if we want to change this type of like stigma around it, we have to start with like these conversations we're having, like panels like this. Like they really do give individuals who are directly impacted by the stereotypes and ideas we're seeing a chance to speak and give their input on the issue.
I'd love to share. I think in hearing this question right now, I don't think I depend on the powers that be to censor my voice. Like I've pretty much just like thrown that out the window. Like it's not even, I don't care, like to be honest. And so just like, I'm grateful for spaces like this because that's like this is it, right? Like people I'm in community with, right? And then for myself, it's just like listening to other marginalized voices. Like that's to me the shift that I can actually have control of, and listening to folks who have been doing this work longer than I have, or have a more nuanced understanding than I do. Like that to me is the only way I feel I have any like power in censoring voices, rather than sitting and expecting those who do have power to, I don't know, come and pick me or something like that. But yeah.
I think there's also something to be said about the perfect victim, and that our society loves the perfect victim, and someone that they can sort of put on, again, it's just put on a pedestal and sort of like show them as like this, that they are representative of every single victim out there. And it's like, I don't need to walk around with bruises or having had to like lose my life for you to take this issue seriously, right? And I think that's something to be said about like our current system that we lived in. And I think that even myself as a survivor didn't truly accept my own experiences because I was like, it's not as valid as someone else's. And that's so false. That's such a false narrative that we give so many young girls. Like, if you have been, like, even someone sending you a dick pic is sexual harassment. I'm sorry, but in my eyes, you're a survivor. Like, I'm so sorry that someone violated your consent on a digital space that's supposed to be safe for you, and like you looked at something. Like, how many men like flash, like, flash us in public, or, catcall us. We have to like constantly look over our shoulders every time. We have to send our location to our friends. We live in this society today, right? And we've seen all of these white women get all up in arms about Sarah, and my heart really does go out to them. But there wasn't nearly the same amount of reaction, to like the 8 victims. And it's also the idea that, oh, that they were working in a massage parlor. Like, it's a risky business. So like, what about sex workers? Like, what about trans folks? What about undocumented immigrants? Again, like, even just going back to the Derek Chauvin trial, like, it's always, why do we have to look at George Floyd's like criminal history? Like, is it real? Like, that there's no place for that. Similarly, there's no place for people to come and judge and be like, oh, but were they here legally? Irrelevant. Okay, was she a sex worker? Irrelevant. But the idea is that those conversations are still happening, right? So with this idea of the perfect victim and the most innocent victim, right? And this is also an issue with like murdered and missing Indigenous women, is like their stories are not even being covered, right? It's always about like, if it's a white girl who has blonde hair and has blue eyes, then that becomes the poster child for missing and murdered children. But if it's like an indigenous person, if it's a Black girl, if it's an Asian girl, then it's like, okay, well, come back to me when you have more saucy details. So like this TV network can get more hits and more views. And we want to capitalize on your deaths, right? Unfortunately, I mean, I don't mean to sound grim, but that's literally why everything is so reactive. And here we are in our small spaces organizing and not like getting any light of day because it's being controlled by people like what's his face billionaire Rupert Murdoch and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I agree. And also, like, the victimhood survivorship narrative is so steeped in white supremacy. Also, like, victimhood survivorship, it's not one or the other. It's like healing's not a destination. I personally don't like that narrative, and I feel like that narrative also plays into survivors of color's experiences because we're told you either have to be like the really perfect victim, not do anything wrong, when that's not how gender-based violence occurs in the real world at all. Or nor the healing from gender-based violence either, because when we live in a world that's so embedded in these systems and dichotomies and binaries, it's hard to move beyond that because that's apparently all people know. um does anyone else want to add anything to that? All right, so with the next question, East and Southeast Asian women and non-cis men tend to be hypersexualized on the terms of white supremacy. Meanwhile, South and West Asian women and non-cis men are desexualized by white supremacy. So how do you all reclaim your sensuality for yourself outside of white supremacy? Varuna, do you want to go first?
Absolutely. I have been seeing a lot of TikTok trends where white girls are being like, they share their DMs from like Indian men, and they were like, oh my God, it's a creepy Indian guy in my DMs. And it's usually someone who, like, okay, firstly, like, yeah, I'm sorry that he's in your DMs. Like, that's true. But it's become sort of this trope that like Indian men are like creepy and they're like desexualized almost to a point where it's like, um that's actually not empowering, that's actually racist. And I think that that's, again, it's like it's so like embedded that you can't separate the two, right? And I think it's so nuanced because it's like a white woman and it's like a brown guy, but then there's like sexism, racism, it sort of is like weirdly ingrained. And I think to a big extent we've also seen like on many, and I always see this on TikTok, like, and it really makes my heart sad. Like, I just delete the app because I feel like there's just no place for like a brown girl there, especially like a South Indian girl. We are so desexualized. Like, every time there's like a brown girl who's embracing her sexuality, and there was someone who was like twerking in shorts, and every comment was, "What is this puja? What will the aunties say?" And it's like not even from like her own community, it's just like random white people coming, they would have seen. And we're just so reduced to these caricatures, right? Like, that's another thing like contributes to the desexualization. It's like Apu from the gas station is like, that we're just arranged marriages, stay within our communities. And again, it's just a conquest. I've heard so many comments being like, oh, I've never been with an Indian girl before. Do you know any of the Kama Sutra positions? And I'm like, wow, you just reduced my entire humanity to a stereotype, but thanks so much. Yeah, I think that it's just so it's definitely a very different experience from the East and Southeast Asian experience. But yeah, I'd love to hear what Jayda and you think.
Jada, do you want to hop in?
Sure. I mean, I I can feel like what Varun is saying, and we've talked a lot about this already. I would love to like, yeah, kind of shift to like the reclaiming part, because I that is also important to talk about. And I think for me, I mean, that's like the biggest chunk of my work, right? It's reclaiming our sensuality outside of white supremacy, outside of patriarchy. And the biggest way I do that, honestly, is through food. And that's always like a person of color kind of situation thing. Like we always just turn to food for like most of our healing. And I turn to food, and like the way I eat my fruit now is I'm like, my mom always calls me out on how improper I am in the way I eat. I like lick my fingers, I let things drip, I let my hands get messy, and like I don't care. And that to me is like a very sensual, primal like act that feels very natural, that we have been taught by white supremacy, by etiquette or whatever, and what it means to be a proper woman, and even just how you eat, which is so natural. Something that is not sexual at all, but we like, depending on how you do it, is seen as like immoral, or like savage, or what, uncivilized, like some of these words. And so I'm really big, because we have to eat it every day. I'm really big on like making sure that I practice some kind of like sensual something with my food, even if that's a second of like really looking at all the colors that are in it, or taking a really slow bite, so that I can feel the textures in my mouth, so like really simple ways. And like the process of cooking itself, I've found really healing and sensual because of that. And so for me, like it always comes down to food. And I think that's the answer for most of our problems right now.
You're making me crack up, but also, yeah, that is the answer to most of our problems right now. Food, healing, food, family. Krisha, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, for me, it is like still really difficult to reclaim my sensuality. I've like always struggled with it, especially like after my assault. I found it like really, like I found myself like at like a weird impasse, I guess, of being like, oh, if I do that, like I'm exposing myself to like the same situation, kind of like I was struggling between that and also being like, oh, well, obviously not. But like I still couldn't like force myself into those like into like really feeling free to explore it. So I still struggle with it. And like for me, a lot of it is just like self-care for me really helps, I guess. Like just like a variety of things like self-care, or like buying like really nice like lingerie or something, like something as simple as that, like which ever since I was like younger, I was told like don't like just buy like Hanes pack, which is fine. I love that. But I also just like treating myself to that and feeling like I can really accept myself in my own body. And I think that's like it's still really difficult for me. I'm not gonna like try and like put on a front, but I think it's like taking small steps to achieving that goal, I think is like still a good way of looking at progress.
Yeah. I love that you say that, Prisha, around like, it's a struggle. It's not going to be like, all right, I got here, all of a sudden I reclaimed it, and I'm waving the flag around like some people can, right? But you're right, like it's a struggle. And I think one of the reasons why I turn to food more often is because of the parallels in the way that we shame people on how they eat and what they eat, in the same way that we shame people over their sexuality. And because food feels more accessible, like it doesn't feel as scary as like having to naked and like do things to my body the way that like sensuality is often portrayed. And so food, just like having a meal that looks and smells, and sometimes even sounds good, is like a simple way, I think, to kind of tap back into that.
Yeah, thank you, Prisha, for being so vulnerable with us and just being honest in that way, because I think we need to hear more stories that it's not necessarily like a one-stop shop to reclaiming your sensuality. And I feel like a lot of social media, especially white sex educators, make people feel like they have to, just reclaim everything. But it's a journey. And I'm so glad that you brought that up and shared with us. Varuna, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was also gonna say that I'm glad that you brought that up, Prisha, that it is like messy, because I think that, after like, years after what happened to me, I could not wear a bra. Like I would wear a bra to sleep. And a small victory for me was not wearing a bra. And then like working up from there, and then like being okay if like, my nipples are showing, and like, being okay with wearing low cut tops. And I think like it's just so small, like, and it takes years. Like, my incident happened when I was like 17, and I'm 30 today, and like only now I was like thinking about what bikinis I can wear, and like that's a win for me. That's a win. Like, and I think that that's, there's so much to be said about that in a society that sort of wants to really, like, especially for South Asians, again, like wants to like desexualize us and be like, oh, you have to be professional all the time, and if you dress like that, you're a hoe. And I'm like, yep, I'm a hoe and a professional. I'm a professional hoe, so thanks.
Yeah, I also agree for my own journey. It's taken time to reclaim that. And also, I feel like, especially as someone who was socialized as a woman early on and within our own communities, there's so much of that purity culture that Jada was talking about earlier that's so ingrained within our parents, especially in our mothers' heads about, oh, you need to be modest. I grew up Chinese Catholic, so a lot of modesty was always perpetuated that I needed to cover myself because, oh no, what if boys look or whatever. Um, and then on top of being raped, uh, it was a lot to work up to the point where I was comfortable now taking boudoir photos because that was a big stepping point for me at least and helped me reclaim myself. So, with that in mind, what do you all wish that people would acknowledge about the experiences of Pan Asian survivors of violence? Varuna?
that it's that it's not a one size fits all. um I have to say that, sometimes it feels, I think each of us have different experiences of like, they have racial experiences, we have different like experiences of like colorism, we have different experiences of like sexualization. And I think that's exactly what I want people to know, like, is that, when we say Asian American, like, who is that? And it's just, I know it's a political term, and it obviously encompasses a lot of different people, but we're also talking about like, Sikhs. We're also talking about like West Asian folks. Like, we almost never see them in the narrative ever. um, and we're also talking about like Muslim women, we're also talking about trans women, we're also talking about queer kids, and like so on and so forth. And it's just like, we really can't have a one size fits all approach towards this. And I really hope that moving forward, um, the different groups can find their way home, if
Mhm.
I can put it in a sentence.
Jada, do you want to go next? Because I saw that your mic is unmuted. So.
Yeah, sure. I really want to uplift what Varuna said earlier around the perfect survivor, because I think that's really, really important to like continue to unpack for ourselves. When we just think of someone who is a victim, right? And the different ways that, because we live in a rape culture, there's so many different small and big ways that like we are subjected to sexual violence, right? Or ways that feel small, I guess, in the, and how people talk about it. But so for me, it's like what we consider a survivor as far as who's worthy of being supported, and whose story is worthy of being told. Yeah, that would be a big one for me.
Prisha, do you want to add anything?
I guess I just want to like echo the same thoughts. I think that we always think it's like a monolith, like the same one story being told. And there's like a lot of variety in what happens to survivors and victims of sexual violence, especially in this community. And I think keeping that in mind before going forward in any conversation is really important. I've like been in spaces where it feels like everyone's like, oh, this is exactly how Asian Americans like experience this type of violence. And it's very alarming, I feel like. So I think having people know that it's not like a one size like fits all type of situation has been really helpful, and creating safer spaces.
Agreed. Also, one of the second to last questions before we go into any questions that the audience here might have on here in the webinar or on Facebook might have what is something that you found liberating on your survivorship journey? Jayda or Varuna? I don't know who wants to go first, but
I can go. I really like this question. And at the same time, it was kind of hard to answer. But I really thought about like what made me feel like hopeful. That's what liberation feels like to me. Like I feel hopeful. I feel like I'm open to something. And it was really finding like transformative justice language and ideology that for me is helping me currently feel liberated, because it, when you really understand transformative justice frameworks, you tackle and unpack that perfect survivor, right? And you also are pushed to think about who, like even the perpetrator, right, or the person who caused harm, and really see that side of things. And I think it's challenging, but there's something very liberating about opening up that possibility of like seeing a better world outside of our current legal system, if you will, outside of the current ways that we think we're supposed to address sexual violence, right? I think for me, transformative justice just feels liberating to sit in and think about like, okay, what are the ways that we need to come together as a community and take care of one another? Because this is all our issue. So, yeah.
Yeah, I can go now. I think a really big thing for me has been like seeing that like obviously like when like an incident like this happens, it really does feel like you're completely alone. And I think learning that there is a community much larger than just me and like the survivors I know at like my university has been really freeing, knowing that it is like unfortunately like a wider problem, but also knowing that people have consistently tried and are still working towards fixing it has been really nice. I think I've always felt like I felt super alone right after my assault, and knowing that unfortunately there is a lot of people in this community, but seeing that these same people in the community are like healing and they're growing and they are not like in the same like beginning stage that I thought I was going to be like perpetually stuck in has been like super liberating, and I think has been one of the biggest keys in like helping me move away from like the point I originally was at after I was assaulted. I feel like right after everything happened, I thought like there was no way I could like move forward, especially as like an Indian girl, just because I was like, I don't know how to explain this to my parents. I don't know how to like get them to like not see that it's like my fault, and knowing that this was not just a me problem really opened my eyes up to seeing like what I could do for the community, because the community was doing so much for me.
Varuna?
Yeah, I definitely echo the thoughts from Jayda and Prisha. I think that community has been a really big part, and not feeling so lonely. I think that we are creating digital spaces, and digital organizing is just so valuable. And you just meet so many amazing people. Like even in this space, I feel so heard and so validated. And like wanting to continue talking about experiences. So that I think has been so incredibly transformative for me.
Agreed. I just wanted to echo everyone's points that were made because I totally resonate with all of them, especially the transformed justice and community care. Like that's what has kept me going all these like 3 years that I've been working through my own stuff. So with that in mind, anyone in the audience, either on Facebook or this webinar, drop your questions in the Q&A box if you're on the Zoom webinar, and then on Facebook. All right. So since there's no questions yet, I'll just hop to the last question and we can take our time with it. What is one thing, I know one thing, that's not a lot, that you want people to learn from this panel today on shifting the narrative within Asian communities? I know that one thing is super hard to like pinpoint, but
I really do think the biggest thing is that there's no perfect victim, and to stop equating and, you know, um, stereotyping everybody's experiences. I think that we really do need to unlearn and just shift away from the idea that there, you know, that only certain news stories are more valuable than the other. Every single survivor story is just as valid and is just as important. And that's really one thing that I would love for us to think about.
Jayda or Prisha, whoever would like to go first or next.
I can go. I still think I feel like it's difficult to just think of like one thing, but I guess like for I'm trying to think, just seeing like, no, I'm really struggling for this. I'm so sorry. I guess along the same lines of what Varuna was saying, maybe just that, especially for this community, it's really difficult to not look at like the imperialistic structure behind how sexual violence works. I feel like a lot of the times in other community, like in if you look at like white cisgender women, like that's not a factor that really plays, it's like considered at all. But when we look at violence in this community and other marginalized communities, looking at the imperialistic side and the colonializational, I don't even think that's a word, but the colonial aspect of it is really important in really understanding why everything is happening from a systemic point of view.
So many things. I think for me, what I hope that people take away, even in hearing our stories, although we ourselves are survivors, just like really thinking about the fact that so many people that they might not know around them are also survivors. And that goes back to like my bigger point, I think, is that like this really is on all of us. Like it's all our responsibility. Whether you think you know a survivor or not, right? Like to care about this issue, to know, to recognize that it's happening, not in this individual way, but it's like, it's our culture, right? Like it is our society. It's not, that's why it's not as important that you know one single person's story in your circle. It's just the fact that we live in an entire society, entire world where people commit sexual violence. And so I think that is what I will want people to understand. And I hope that that gives people like some sense of like responsibility. Yeah.
Thank you all for sharing your wonderful thoughts. So far, we don't have any questions, but since we have some more time, where can everyone find your work and support you all? And also, I wanted to note that there's a gratitude tip jar that's on my link in bio, as well as End Rape on Campus's link in bio and Every Voice Coalition's link in bio. So please pay these wonderful panelists for their time and labor and just the amazing thoughts and energy that they're all bringing today. Yeah, where can we all support you? If you want to,
I typed in the chat box in case it's easy for people, but yeah, I'm mostly on Instagram kind of, but I send out a lot of like events and updates more on my email list, my website, but yeah, I think the easiest way is Instagram for now.
also, both Prisha and Varuna put their Instagrams on the chat in the chat, so y'all can all check out their work on Instagram, which seems to be the place that most people can find everyone. Oh, and Kenyora just put the gratitude tip jar in the chat as well, so that you can send money to any of the panelists. And I'm just so grateful that we're able to have this conversation and share space in this way. It's really great to share space with all of you. And I've learned a lot from this conversation as well.
This is great. It just feels like talking to friends, but like friends who get it, you know? friends I don't have to like convince or not going to play devil's advocate with me. Gosh.
That is such that I was just thinking, I was like, this is so, I feel so good. I love this organizing space that you all have created. And I was just thinking, I was like, Jayda and me and Sydney have had so much overlap. It just really makes me so happy that I like continue to hang out, but also do important work with you all. And I've like never met you in person. So this is awesome. Like we all live in different cities, in different time zones, maybe.
I would have, college me would have cried knowing that I would be here on a panel with other Asian folks talking about this. Oh my God, like she would have, no, no way. No way. This is amazing.
Yeah, college me will cry like later today, 100%. Like I know, I already know.
Yeah, college me would have been like, especially senior year me would have been like, what is this? What's happening? How is she doing this?
Yeah.
And now to be here is just an absolute honor, and to be able, this was the first panel that I've ever moderated. So that's a win. Also, if we're all ready to close this conversation, I'm gonna hand the mic back off to Nora if you all are ready to wrap this conversation up.
We're good. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm gonna pass the mic back to Nora now.
Wonderful. Well, Sydney, Prisha, Varuna, and Jayda, thank you so much for being here and holding this space. It's been really beautiful and powerful to hear from all of you and to be able to sort of witness the space that was held. And Sydney, congratulations on moderating your first panel. I am so, so happy that you were able to do this, because I know that this was a dream that we talked about before. And so that's it for me. Just thank you so, so much. And I know that you'd put your sort of contact information, or rather Instagram information, in the chat. So I definitely would encourage folks to follow everyone. I know I have, and it's been really powerful to see. All right, I'll pass it to Kenyora to close finally off.
I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you for your vulnerability, your expertise, your willingness to be authentic and be in this space, to really just truly talk about the realistic, like the realism of what's happening, especially I've said this to you all before in like our run through, like even for me as a survivor and a Black woman, there has been so many parallels that you all have spoken to. And, I can't reiterate, Varuna, the point that you made that, essentially survivors' experiences of sexual assault are, one, not monolithic. Two, there's no like same snowflake, in terms of, or the same butterfly, if you will, that experiences, this type of epidemic, pandemic, all of the epics, whatever you want to call it. But that we really truly need to pay attention to the unique needs and particular needs of everyone who experiences sexual assault, regardless of what their identity is. Sexual assault does not discriminate. I think that's exactly what you said. And, I definitely want to really reiterate that. And so I'm just so thankful to all of you of also just allowing EROC and EBC to, serve as a space and platform for you to share your stories and to share just your insights. Because, centering the margins, it's really important to the work that we do. And we can't do this work without doing that. And so, I just want to truly express my gratitude to each of you. And that I hope that this is just a start of a beautiful friendship, beautiful, partnership, and, that we continue to have these conversations, because honestly, my wheels are turning and I'm trying to think how we can come back together again, and maybe even talk a little bit more about the true like intersectionalities between, Black communities and Pan-Asian communities, and really, having that type of conversation, because woo, that would probably be a 2-hour conversation, to be honest. But again, I seriously just want to again extend my gratitude to each of you, and to all of you who have joined in with us and have heard from these beautiful, beautiful individuals. Again, please be sure to send in your gratitude to our gratitude jar. All of the proceeds will be split amongst them equally. This will not go back towards EROC. This is really for our panelists. So we really truly take, survivors who are sharing their story seriously. And, we're very intentional in terms of creating that space for them to do so. So we want to make sure that they're being seen for what they're worth, and, just being seen in this space. And so again, thank you so much. We will have this recording available for you on all of our platforms just as soon as we, make that happen. So please continue to enjoy the rest of your week. Take care of yourselves. And until then, stay blessed. And for all survivors out there, we see you, we hear you, and we believe you. Bye, everyone.